For decades, the US-Canada relationship was treated as administrative rather than existential. It lived in the background of geopolitics, assumed rather than debated. Trade disputes were managed. Security coordination was procedural. Sovereignty was never the question because the framework itself was taken for granted. That is why a warning from a former Canadian Prime Minister lands so heavily now. It signals that something once invisible has moved into the foreground. What was previously routine alliance management is being reinterpreted as a test of national autonomy. This reframing doesn't emerge from a single policy decision or a dramatic rupture. It grows out of accumulated pressure that has been normalized over time. Economic leverage applied casually, security expectations treated as obligations rather than partnerships, diplomatic asymmetries dismissed as pragmatism. Individually, none of this looked like a sovereignty issue. Collectively, it changes how power is experienced. When decisions made in Washington begin to shape Canada's economic exposure, strategic options, and policy margins without meaningful reciprocity, the question quietly shifts from cooperation to control. This wasn't about hostility or intent. That distinction matters. Sovereignty erosion rarely arrives as aggression. It arrives as dependency that hardens into structure. Supply chains become locked in. Security assumptions narrow. Policy flexibility shrinks. At that point, even neutral actions by a larger partner carry disproportionate consequences. The warning reframes this reality not as mismanagement, but as risk. Hidden in plain sight, the relationship stops being defined by shared interests and starts being defined by asymmetric exposure. The progression here is psychological before it is institutional. Once sovereignty enters the conversation, every interaction is reinterpreted. Trade is no longer just commerce, it's leverage. Security cooperation is no longer reassurance, it's constraint. Diplomatic alignment is no longer convenience, it's expectation. That shift changes behavior even without formal change. Policymakers begin to ask different questions, not how to optimize the relationship, but how to protect room to maneuver within it. That is the moment alliance logic weakens. The climax of this reframing is not confrontation, but alarm. When a former head of government publicly frames the relationship in sovereignty terms, it reflects conversations already happening behind closed doors. It suggests that what once felt manageable now feels structural. The concern is no longer about a bad deal or an unfriendly administration. It's about a pattern that survives leadership changes. That's the endgame fear, not disruption, but permanence. From my perspective, this is where the danger lies. Sovereignty debates harden quickly because they cut deeper than policy. Once autonomy is perceived to be at risk, compromise becomes politically toxic. Every concession is scrutinized, every dependency is questioned, and every reassurance from the larger partner is discounted as temporary. The relationship enters a defensive posture without declaring one. The resolution for now is a shift in framing that cannot be easily reversed. The US-Canada relationship still functions. Institutions remain intact. Cooperation continues. But the underlying lens has changed. What was once assumed is now interrogated. What was once routine is now strategic. That reframing doesn't break alliances overnight, but it destabilizes them over time. Because when sovereignty becomes the organizing principle, alignment becomes conditional. And conditional alignment in a system built on proximity and interdependence is inherently brittle. Trust between states is rarely declared. It is inferred from patterns, from restraint, from the confidence that power will be exercised within understood limits. For decades, the US-Canada relationship operated on that unspoken confidence. Power asymmetry existed, but it was cushioned by predictability. Decisions were bounded. Pressure was calibrated. The assumption was not equality, but reliability. What this statement signals is that those assumptions no longer feel secure. The shift is not about a single policy or a sudden confrontation. It's about how power is now perceived to move through the relationship. When actions by the larger partner begin to feel less constrained by precedent and more driven by leverage, trust erodes quietly. not because cooperation ends, but because its terms change. What once felt mutual begins to feel conditional, and conditionality is corrosive when it becomes systemic rather than situational. This wasn't about rhetoric, it was about signals. Signals embedded in how disputes are handled, how dependencies are treated, and how consequences are distributed. When economic or security pressure is applied in ways that leave little room for reciprocal influence, smaller partners recalibrate. They stop assuming benign intent and start modeling worst-case exposure. That recalibration doesn't require hostility, it requires uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what dissolves trust at the strategic level. The progression here is subtle but decisive. Bilateral trust rests on shared expectations about boundaries. What happens when those boundaries blur? When measures once considered exceptional start to feel routine? When leverage is normalized as a tool rather than reserved as a last resort? At that point, trust stops being about goodwill and starts being about risk management, and risk management assumes vulnerability, not partnership. The statement reflects a belief that the old equilibrium has shifted, that the balance between influence and autonomy no longer tilts predictably. From Ottawa's perspective, the concern is not that the US has power. That was never in doubt. The concern is how that power is now being exercised and whether prior assumptions about restraint still apply. Once those assumptions weaken, every future interaction is filtered through a different lens, not cooperation by default, but caution. The climax of this shift is psychological. When trust thins, even neutral actions take on new meaning. Policy decisions are interpreted less as isolated moves and more as signals of intent. Planning horizons shorten. Hedging accelerates. The relationship becomes less about alignment and more about insulation. That's when power dynamics stop feeling stable and start feeling extractive, even if no one intends them to be. This is where strategic miscalculation enters. One side may believe it is acting efficiently, decisively, even reasonably. The other experiences those same actions as unpredictability. That asymmetry is dangerous because trust requires symmetry of expectation. When one side assumes continuity and the other assumes volatility, the relationship drifts without either side formally acknowledging it. From my vantage point, this is the warning embedded in the statement. It's not an accusation, it's a diagnosis. A recognition that the informal rules governing the relationship are no longer trusted to hold. And once trust collapses at that level, restoring it is far harder than maintaining it would have been. The resolution for now is a relationship that still functions, but no longer rests on confidence. It rests on calculation. That may keep things stable in the short term, but it also raises the stakes of every decision. Because when trust is replaced by hedging, misinterpretation becomes more likely. And in a system defined by proximity and deep interdependence, misinterpretation is often the spark that turns manageable friction into escalation. When warnings like this surface, their real weight isn't in the words themselves, it's in how they change planning behavior. Rhetoric fades quickly, interpretation doesn't, and this is where the implications deepen. Once a relationship is reframed through the lens of sovereignty risk, every form of dependence is reassessed simultaneously. Economic ties, security coordination, political alignment, none of them remain neutral. They become variables in a single calculation: exposure. For Canada, economic dependence has always been manageable because it was embedded in predictability. Trade flowed not just because it was efficient, but because it was assumed to be insulated from sudden weaponization. That assumption is now under strain. When leverage is perceived as more readily available, economic integration stops looking like mutual benefit and starts looking like asymmetric risk. The response isn't dramatic retaliation, it's quiet adjustment, diversification, redundancy, reduced reliance where alternatives exist, even if they are more costly. Cost becomes secondary to control. Security dependence follows a similar logic. Coordination doesn't end, intelligence still flows, defense structures remain intact, but the meaning of alignment changes. When political signals suggest that power may be applied transactionally rather than institutionally, security guarantees are no longer treated as automatic. They are stress tested. Contingency planning expands. Scenarios that once lived on the margins move toward the center. This isn't about doubting alliances. It's about recognizing that reliance without insulation creates vulnerability when assumptions shift. Politically, the implications are even more subtle. Political dependence doesn't look like submission, it looks like constraint. When a smaller state believes its policy space may be narrowed by economic or security leverage, it begins to internalize limits before they are imposed. That's how power works most effectively. Not through coercion, but through anticipation. Decisions are shaped by what might trigger pressure, not just by domestic priorities. Over time, that erodes perceived autonomy even if no explicit demand is ever made. The progression here is cumulative. Economic hedging reinforces security caution. Security caution feeds political restraint. Political restraint validates economic diversification. Each move looks rational in isolation. Together, they mark a strategic shift. Canada's interpretation of dependence moves from benign interconnection to latent exposure. And once that reinterpretation takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. Every episode of pressure, real or perceived, confirms the logic. The climax of this dynamic is psychological rather than material. When dependence is reframed as a risk, trust stops being the default operating system. Calculation replaces it. Policy becomes defensive by design. The relationship still functions, but it does so with less depth and less tolerance for ambiguity. That loss of tolerance matters, because ambiguity is where cooperation usually lives. This wasn't about abandoning integration. It was about rebalancing vulnerability, and that rebalancing has consequences beyond Canada. When one partner quietly restructures dependence, the entire relationship recalibrates. Expectations diverge. Communication becomes more cautious. Intentions are read defensively. Even benign actions are filtered through the question of leverage. From where I'm standing, this is the danger embedded in the moment. Not escalation through confrontation, but escalation through reinterpretation. When economic, security, and political ties are no longer assumed to be stabilizing, they stop stabilizing, they become conditional, and conditional systems are brittle, they hold until they don't. The resolution is uneasy. Canada doesn't disengage, it adapts, it insulates, it plans for volatility rather than continuity. That may reduce exposure in the short term, but it also thins the connective tissue that once absorbed shocks. And when that tissue weakens, even small disruptions carry more force. That's why this matters now, because the most destabilizing shifts in geopolitics rarely announce themselves as breaks. They emerge when dependence quietly stops feeling safe, and the system reorganizes around that fear. Moments like this don't announce themselves as turning points. They reveal themselves in what policymakers begin to prioritize, protect, and quietly redesign. When autonomy becomes the organizing principle, it doesn't show up first in speeches. It shows up in planning assumptions, in risk models, in the questions that start guiding decisions behind closed doors. And once those questions change, policy follows. Safeguarding autonomy isn't about isolation. It's about reducing exposure to external leverage. That distinction matters. States rarely seek independence for its own sake. They seek insulation when they believe interdependence can be used against them. When autonomy rises to the center of policy thinking, it signals that the perceived cost of reliance has crossed a threshold. Not hypothetical, not abstract, operational. The context here is cumulative pressure. Years of integration created efficiency and growth, but also concentration. Concentration creates fragility. When signals emerge that power may be exercised transactionally rather than predictably, fragility becomes intolerable. The policy response isn't dramatic rupture, it's systematic recalibration. Trade policy becomes less about maximizing volume and more about diversifying partners. Security policy shifts from assumption of alignment to verification of reliability. Political strategy narrows its exposure to external pressure points. This progression is subtle but decisive. Autonomy becomes the filter through which policy options are evaluated. Not, does this strengthen the relationship, but does this reduce vulnerability? That's a different operating logic. It changes timelines. It changes tolerance for cost. It changes what trade-offs are acceptable. Short-term inefficiency becomes an acceptable price for long-term control. The critical shift happens when this logic spreads across institutions. Once autonomy is treated as a shared objective rather than a niche concern, it embeds itself. Economic ministries prioritize redundancy. Defense planners expand independent capacity. Diplomatic strategy emphasizes optionality. None of this requires confrontation. It requires alignment around a single belief. Dependence is now a risk to be managed, not a feature to be optimized. The climax of this turning point is strategic reorientation. Policy stops assuming that stability will be preserved externally and starts assuming it must be generated internally. That assumption is powerful. It reshapes investment. It alters alliances. It changes how commitments are framed. Cooperation continues, but it is bounded, conditional, reversible. That's the mark of autonomy-first thinking. What makes this moment dangerous is not the pursuit of autonomy itself. It's the feedback loop it creates. As one side prioritizes insulation, the other interprets it as distancing. That interpretation reinforces caution. Caution justifies further insulation. The system drifts not because of hostility, but because of prudence. And prudence, once validated, spreads quickly. This isn't about nationalism or retreat. It's about survivability in an environment perceived as less predictable. When policymakers believe external pressure may arrive without warning or restraint, they build buffers. Buffers reduce risk, but they also reduce trust. Over time, the relationship changes character. It becomes transactional rather than integrative, stable but shallow. The resolution is uneasy. Autonomy as a central principle brings resilience, but it also fragments shared systems. It weakens the informal glue that once absorbed shocks before they escalated. Coordination becomes slower, misinterpretation becomes more likely, and when crises arrive, they arrive in a system with less elasticity. From where I'm standing, this is the real inflection point. Not a break, not a rupture, a reordering of priorities. Once safeguarding autonomy becomes the default lens, reversing course requires a restoration of trust that goes beyond rhetoric. It requires a change in incentives and behavior. Until that happens, policy will continue to harden quietly around self-protection. And systems built primarily for self-protection are inherently less stable under stress. That's the danger at the end of this path.